Hello, and welcome to my talk, Leveling Up Collective Creativity with the Power of Disruptive Diversity. This is me. For the longest time, I felt like I didn't fit in the games industry. On my first day of university, someone told me that when I stood up in front of the class to introduce myself, they thought I'd wandered into the wrong classroom. When I got a placement year, and most of the class didn't, they told me to my face, as fact, that it was because I was a girl. I was desperate to fit in an all-male environment, and so I gave up a lot of myself, and I masked the rest in order to be normal and be one of the guys. I used to dress quite alternatively, but I was made aware that this was not the preference of our producer, and so I also took steps to become more normal. Anyone else neurodiverse will know that masking, aka pretending to be someone you're not, for at least 8 hours a day, is exhausting. Disruptive diversity is a term I made up to describe the opposite of that. It's about embracing the differences in who we are and utilizing those differences to create something better together. So, what are we going to talk about today? I'm going to start by talking about collective intelligence and how we've developed as a species. This will take me on to something called the wisdom of crowds. I'm then going to provide more of a definition of disruptive diversity, and I'll round off by talking about some of the ways we can support this in our everyday work. Throughout the course of human history, we have proved that we are better together. There is a theory that despite the individually bigger brains of the Neanderthals, humans were able to endure because of their collective social intelligence. The idea is that because humans lived in bigger groups, they were able to learn and pass information on to one another regarding tools, transport of water, and optimum food preparation methods, for example, far more quickly than the more solitary Neanderthals. I've gone ahead and mocked up what I believe this looked like in an abridged version, using the help of some collective human intelligence, aka generative AI. So here we have the very first caveman. He has found some tasty berries. Unfortunately for him, they weren't edible, and now he's dead. But someone else from his group has helpfully come along and taken note of the fact that these berries are in fact poisonous. The Neanderthal comes along, it's a different bush, same berries. He also partakes of the tasty berries, and he dies. Generation 2 of our cave folks come along, and for whatever reason, they try cooking the berries and discover that this makes them edible. Also, they've discovered fire and cooking. This is a very sped up version of human history, and I've taken some liberties with the historical accuracies of this, I know. But stay with me. Generation 2 of our Neanderthals comes along, partakes of the tasty berries, and dies. This time, however, for the sake of moving things along, another Neanderthal comes along and realizes they probably better not eat the berries. Generation 3 of our cave folks have figured out how to make weapons, fight lions as a group, and cook a tasty steak. Whereas the Neanderthal has a weapon but isn't doing too well against the lion. A few generations later, humans have figured out how to transport water, set off on an adventure, and started living in settlements, with dinosaurs apparently. The Neanderthals, however, are still relatively solitary, sick from all that raw meat, and limited to living close to sources of water. Again, I've taken massive liberties with the historical accuracy of this, but the point I was making is that generally humans were able to innovate and develop faster because of their unique social structure and ability to communicate ideas from generation to generation and from group to group. In fact, we can see over time that as humans came together in bigger and bigger groups and had the increased opportunity to travel and more ways in which to communicate ideas across the globe, innovation and invention increased rapidly in pace. Speaking of innovation, I think we're all familiar with the concept of the eureka moment. The idea of the eureka moment is attributed to Archimedes, who, upon getting into the bath, noticed the displacement of the water and realized that it was equal to his volume, thus creating the Archimedes principle and leading him to run naked through the streets yelling "Eureka!" in his excitement. He didn't create this out of nowhere, though. He had a problem he was trying to solve, which was whether or not the king's crown was made of solid gold, And he knew that different metals had different weights. And once he realized that the water was displaced equal to the volume, he knew how to solve the problem. Even if you weren't familiar with this, I'm sure we've all had those moments when suddenly everything clicks into place and the solution to that problem we've been mulling over just clicks into place too. Usually, I find it happens when you've put the problem on the back burner and gone to do something else. The answer just appears while you're in the shower, cooking dinner, or just lying in bed. What happened for Archimedes was that perfect combination of ideas that leads to something new. This leads me to the theory of the adjacent possible. Bear with me. The adjacent possible was a theory introduced by biologist Stuart Kauffman to explain human evolution and innovation, and follows the idea that in biological evolution, you don't go from this to this. There's a lot of steps in between, and about 4 million years of evolutionary advancements. There's a complicated mathematical theorem to explain this idea, but I much prefer this dumbed-down version. The theory of the adjacent possible also helps explain the phenomenon observed throughout history, whereby folks in completely different places with no known connection to one another were able to come up with the same invention around the same time. This is known as the theory of the multiple, and the most famous of these are the telephone, the light bulb, and the steam engine, which was credited to no less than 10 different inventors, possibly more. In fact, the authors of a scientific paper written in 1922 managed to identify 148 instances of simultaneous invention, and there have of course been many more since. One thing that's for sure is that none of these inventors came up with something from nothing. These all fulfilled some need that humanity had at the time, and/or built upon something that came before. We see this a lot in video games. All of the groups of games above, each group very similar in premise, were announced and released within a very short time frame of one another. Some of this can be put down to trend forecasting, which is what businesses use to predict what will be popular a few years down the line. Given the length of the development cycle of games these days, it makes sense that a lot of companies would be utilizing trend forecasting and that the base data would be largely similar, thus producing these similar concepts. Also, looking at the release dates, the top three were all probably going through conception at the height of the popularity of the Vikings TV show. The bottom two came out during the early 2000s superhero trend. And the three on the right I'm just putting down to the theory of the multiple and the fact that Japan is always trending amongst gamers. The thing is, these games may all have a similar premise, but they are different because they are shaped by the individuals that made them. Let's do a quick thought experiment. If I was to ask all of you, watching at home, to come up with an idea for a game based on everyday life, I believe we'd get a few common answers. There's things like commuting, working in the office or at home, cooking, and maybe shopping. However, I think if I asked you to come up with a game based on your hobbies, we'd probably start to see some common topics, but some definite divergences. We might have games based around playing games or, rock climbing. A lot of game devs seem to like rock climbing in just about every company I've worked in. But then we'd also start to see things like surfing, golf, or zorbing. If I asked you to think of a game based on an experience from your childhood or a recent holiday, we'd probably start to see even more divergence. And if I started making a big list of those ideas right now, it would likely spark new ideas, and those original ideas would recombine into something that might actually be a viable game premise. Very few games are truly innovative, just as very few inventions come out of nowhere or gain notoriety if there is simply no need or demand for them. For years, the term Doom clone was used to refer to any number of games that relied on the same 2.5D rendering tech that Doom did, and involved shooting things with a gun at the forefront of the screen. Which implies, probably incorrectly, that there was nothing new or innovative at all about them. At some point, we collectively decided that this was a genre, first-person shooters, and these days I doubt anyone would refer to Call of Duty as a Doom clone. Oddly enough, Doom wasn't even the first Doom clone, but I feel like it has a catchier ring to it than Wolfenstein 3D clones. Also, when I was writing this, I had the realization that we still call roguelikes. It's difficult to say twice. And to be fair, that is actually also way easier to say than Beneath Apple Manor likes. Anyway, being a game designer isn't about having the best ideas. While it's said that the most creative among us can jump ahead a couple of tiers along the adjacent possible, good ideas can come from anywhere and anyone. The idea is actually the easy part. The job of the game designer is to take that and design a viable system around it. Good designers are open to ideas from anywhere and to the recombination of those ideas into something new, something hopefully innovative. It's actually very difficult for one person to come up with a truly innovative idea. It can take years and years for a hunch to become a eureka moment. And these days, in this industry, things move so fast that we don't really have the luxury of years and years to percolate over that one eureka-worthy idea. However, we are living in a time where it is more feasible than ever to communicate and share our ideas with one another, and to access all of those shared ideas that came before. Although we are limited by the adjacent possible when it comes to supporting technology especially, we have a huge amount of collective intelligence that we can use to push forward in the creative sense, and guess what? We are all diverse. We all have unique perspectives and experiences that shape who we are and how we perceive the world around us. And it is due, in part, to our differences in context and perspective that we are able to advance as a society. So what is diversity? Well, here's a list of 39 workplace diversities that were compiled by a recruitment firm. You've got your internal diversities, external diversities, worldview diversities, organizational diversities even. And it's true that some of these are more prominent than others, but this list just goes to show that there are so many different contexts that we have all lived through, and each of these put each of us in a unique position to bring a diverse and different perspective into the group. This brings me on to the wisdom of crowds. The Wisdom of Crowds is the title of a 2004 book by James Surowiecki, exploring the idea that the many are smarter than the few, and offering a number of case studies to back this up. It's a pretty good read, and its core theory is that the collective opinion of a diverse and independent group of individuals is better than that of a single expert. From this, the following 5 elements of a wise crowd are generally extrapolated, and the following 5 limitations. It's fair to say that in the games industry, there has been a history that leans us towards those limitations. Classically, we have seen homogeneity in our leadership, division in our team structures, and there are certainly companies in which the centralization of a few individuals managing a portfolio of projects within the business leads to a lack of overall diversity in the products they produce. Speaking of homogeneity, when it comes to data, there's a great book called Invisible Women I've been reading that highlights just how much the world is shaped by our innate preconception of the default male. So much so that when Nintendo were looking for a method by which to shock the player back in 1986, they could think of nothing more unexpected than having the protagonist of one of their games turn out to be a woman. I mention this largely because it made me notice something when I was generating the artwork for this talk. When I asked the designer image generator for images of people, I never specified that I wanted them to appear male. But, and I doubt many of you noticed this to be honest, because I didn't at first, but only one of the pictures I generated of cave people included anyone that appeared to be female. In fact, of the images, with the exception of one, they are all characteristically male, white cave people, even though the prompts I gave included always the word people and not man. Also, when I tried asking it for such a thing as a female cave person, I got this, I got this, I got this, and I got this. From this, I can of course surmise that all female cave people are red-headed, demanding, at home, and that at least 50% of the time they are shaped like early Lara Croft. I repeated this experiment a few times with terms like police officer, and I got largely the same results. And of course, when I asked for a shocked gamer for the previous slide, I got the following images. I'm not necessarily feeling shocked or excluded by these images, although I have noticed that there is such a lack of diversity in them that two of them appear to be the same guy, and one of them could be his younger brother. I can ask the AI to give me pictures of female gamers, but if I don't, then the result is the default male. And that's, of course, not to mention the lack of ethnic diversity, although I was pleased to see a little here. Since generative AI is trained through input data and patterns, then I feel that this is a pretty good example of what happens when there's a lack of diversity in the input, i.e., the output is less diverse. I'm going to talk about how we can support those different inputs in our creative processes, but first, I'd like to go on to the final theoretical portion of my talk and explain a little bit more about what I mean by the term disruptive diversity. The idea that came to me when I was first planning this talk was this. Here we have a game developer, as indicated by the uniform of the game developer, the plaid shirt. She likes cats, video games, and Japan. Here is her colleague, also a video game developer. She also likes cats, video games, and Japan. They're from different countries, but they're very alike. Developer 1 is talking about adding a robot character to the game they are working on. Developer 2 has a pretty good idea of what a robot is, so they're pretty much on the same page. Developer 3 joins the conversation, and although she is quite similar to the others in some ways, she grew up in one of those countries in which the term robot is what they use to describe the object that I would term a traffic light. And I'm sorry, this one's in here just for the Scramble team, but that's how you end up with Traffic Light Kid. Also, that's not true as far as I know. They do call traffic lights robots in South Africa, but for the real story of how Traffic Light Kid came to be, you probably want to ask the actual artist, Alex van Mierlo, on the Scramble concept team. Anyway, here's the Merriam-Webster Dictionary definition of disruption, which I chose because I feel it's closest to what I mean when I talk about disruption in this context. For me, what we're talking about today is this: a disruption to the flow of an idea or concept from some outside influence that results in something wholly new. Referring back to the wisdom of crowds, one of the experiments done to show the limitations of a group in coming to a common consensus proved that entire groups could be swayed to agree with one objectively incorrect individual that had been planted among them. When asked afterward, participants in the study would say that they did know the rest of the group was wrong, but they didn't want to be the one to go against them. Disruptive diversity is about going against the group. It's about recognizing that your perception is valid, your context is unique, and you can add value because of that. I'm not saying that this has to be a fight, but rather that so many of us recognize that we can see what we believe to be the truth of a situation and don't speak up because we assume things like others must know better than us, or that what we have to say is something that everyone else will already be thinking. I'm not saying it's on the individual to do all of the work. In fact, I think it's the opposite, and that we can work together to create a space in which everyone feels they can input into the creative process without having to be afraid to speak up or fight to be heard. So, how do we support a diverse level of input into our creative process? Actively seek out a more diverse range of inputs. Good ideas come from everywhere. Do something new, play different games, learn about something random, have someone shed their passion with you, share your ideas with them. But most importantly, seek out different perspectives. One of the best ways we do this in design is through brainstorming. There's a lot of different ways to run these, and I've seen some great formats at Sumo already. Miro provides a ton of different templates for running these virtually, which is how we do most things these days anyway, and it can have some benefits that I'll discuss in a moment. Firstly, though, make sure that you are bringing in as many different perspectives as possible. To be honest, if you bring in a lot of people who are already aligned with the ideas you have, then you're way less likely to hit upon something new. Make sure you throw some wildcards into the mix. Set some ground rules to make sure that everyone feels safe to pitch their ideas, however wacky. The last thing we want is someone silenced by any perceived mockery or putting down of their ideas. Remember, there are no bad ideas. Some might just fit the context better than others. You never know though, because as I talked about earlier, you may accidentally hit on the perfect recombination of ideas that you'd never have come up with without that disruptive input. Again, I mentioned Miro because, used well, this is a great way to even the playing field for folks who might classically find it difficult to be heard in a group setting. The brainstorms I used to attend or run in person almost always followed a similar format. One person had a marker pen and everyone yelled out ideas while that one poor soul tried to keep up and capture everything on the board. Each idea sparked new ideas, and about half the time we ended up designing entire systems on the fly or going off on tangents about zombies on water slides. Earlier, I mentioned the limitations of crowd wisdom, and one of them was imitation. In the classic format I described above, some people will find it easier to contribute than others, and the ideas of the group will tend to be led by the first few people that spoke, leading the group to converge upon ideas quickly. This kind of works well in some situations, I suppose, but in a brainstorm, we want to keep the pool of ideas as open and as varied as we can for as long as possible. For this reason, I suggest finding a way to have everyone contribute individually first. For instance, having everyone write down their ideas autonomously on post-it notes, if you're in person, or on separate areas of the Miro board, should allow for a much larger variation of ideas and unique inputs than might otherwise have become limited by groupthink. Sorry about that. If you're following the above guidelines and having everyone input individually first, then share of voice might not be as much of an issue during those initial brainstorms. When it comes to the follow-up discussions, however, this is something I think it's worth taking into account. So I'm going to explain a bit more about this on the next couple of slides. Share of voice is a term I first read about in David Marquette's Leadership is Language. The book centers around the real-life loss of the El Faro, a cargo ship that sailed into the path of a storm. It's a rather extreme example of what can go wrong when you have a highly centralized decision-making structure. But it's fascinating because there are transcripts of every conversation that happened on board in the 25 hours leading up to the disaster. By analysing these transcripts, Marquette breaks down a number of conversations that happened when both senior and junior crew members were present, and analyses how often each person spoke. Share of voice. In doing this, he shows that the share of voice, whenever the captain is present, is skewed massively in favour of him and the next most senior person present. There is always a third, more junior person present, and they speak about 3% of the time. I kind of hope that person 3 was there getting on with something else, manning some dials and buttons like they have in films. But if not, then it begs the question, why were they there? If this was a meeting, a design discussion, or a brainstorm, we'd want to make sure that everyone present was there for a purpose and was able to contribute. Someone's actually created a tool for measuring this using transcripts of Teams calls, which would be fascinating to try out, but I thoroughly do not recommend that we start uploading our Teams transcripts into any third-party tools. It would be really cool, though, to look at how we can measure this for ourselves and see how we measure up on this front. taking into account, of course, that some people might have contributed more in the chat, but also looking at whether or not these contributions were regarded equally. There is actually a tool in Microsoft Teams that I started playing around with while I was writing this talk called Speaker Coach, which is thoroughly off-putting during meetings while it constantly tells me to speak slower and stop using the word cool, but really fascinating to look at afterwards. Throughout the course of a day, where I was definitely sure I talked too much, I saw that the time I spent speaking was actually quite balanced among the number of folks who were in each call with me. That said, I do remember this particular call, and I think the share of voice looked a bit like the diagram from the previous slide, although I did ask the third participant and they told me they were at least getting on with something else in the background. So, how can we begin to create a safe space to support diversity of input? In my opinion, consider each person on the merit of the unique perspective that they bring. Respect the differences. Don't deny them. People have a tendency to say things like, oh, I don't see gender or skin colour, but the differences are there, and the experiences some folks have had as a result of those differences may make it more difficult for them to contribute. Respect that the differences are there, but don't call them out unnecessarily. For instance, don't invite someone to speak for a woman's perspective on the matter. Instead, make sure everyone is able to contribute when they might have a perspective to offer, and try to recognise when that might be. Don't call attention to someone being the only whatever in the room, and don't make assumptions about someone's individual experiences and what they might have to say on the matter. It's incredibly awkward when someone assumes that all women will have a first-hand perspective on childbearing, or indeed that every woman is also a womb bearer, for example. In a similar vein, let go of stereotypes. Sorry about that. In a similar vein, let go of stereotypes. It's hard to speak up if you think you're going to be labelled as stupid because of your accent, or some kind of radical feminist because someone just referred to the group you're a part of as fellas. Lastly, challenge your biases. I love this image because it really sums up unconscious gender bias more succinctly than I ever could. Interestingly, though, when I went looking for this image, I did stumble upon results of a study that also showed that women are far more likely to be perceived negatively for drawing attention to these topics than men are, which is really sad. It reminds me of one of the worst pieces of advice I ever got in this industry, although I know it came from a good place. Back when I was struggling to be heard and finding that my male colleagues were gaining more traction presenting the same ideas that I had previously, I was told that I'd probably have more success if I did just align with a male colleague before every meeting and had him present my ideas for me. That's not an environment I want to work in, or advice I ever want to hear repeated to anyone again, no matter what their diversity is. I'm aware I've talked a lot about gender diversity, but to be fair, as a woman, that's largely what I've experienced. I'm also neurodiverse, but to be honest, neither of these things feel like they're my whole identity, and my gender has played a much more obvious role throughout my career. This goes back to what I said at the top of my last slide. Consider each person on the merit they bring. Don't ever make someone feel like they're there to tick a box. Everybody's input is valid, and everybody has a voice. Thank you.